Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannick, and today is a very special episode. I'm sure you've probably heard by now, Karen Davis, the founder and president of United Poultry Concerns, died on November 4th, 2023. This episode is my memorial to her. It's a compilation of segments from my 4 interviews with Karen on this podcast. They were recorded between 2020 and 2021. So this episode is kind of a greatest hits or the best of the best from those 4 episodes. Karen and United Poultry Concerns were the first sponsors of this podcast. I created this podcast while working for United Poultry Concerns. I worked for Karen between 2012 and 2021. And going back and listening to these interviews, I was once again reminded of how powerful Karen was, how knowledgeable she was about every intricacy of the issues, and how passionately she spoke for the birds. Also, just how intelligently she spoke about it all. She had such an authoritative presence and a strong, articulate way of speaking. It's just really powerful to hear. I got pretty close to Karen when we were working together for that decade, and I really considered her like a mother, like a vegan, animal-loving mother that I never had, a mother that understood the passion for animal advocacy. But anytime I would say anything like that, anything kind of sappy, Karen didn't like that. She did not like anything mushy or sentimental. And I think that's why she kept her illness so quiet. She didn't like talking about herself or her health or really anything emotional. Personally, any emotion expressed was about the chickens. And then she would express just a wide range of emotions. I mean, the happiest I ever saw her was when she was talking about the chickens. To her, any sympathy, empathy, she wanted that directed to the chickens. She was very selfless in that way. You know, you so often hear in our movement that word tirelessly, that they worked tirelessly on something. Well, that really was Karen. I mean, truly was Karen. She did work tirelessly. Every ounce of energy she had, day and night, weekday or weekend, it was for the chickens. Listening to these interviews again, I had to hold back tears at some points, not only for the just intense content of her describing the suffering of the animals, but there were some really sweet stories of her interactions with the chickens that I'm sure you will love. I'm feeling her loss deeply. It's a loss for the movement, it's a loss for the animals, it's really a loss for us all. But now it's up to us to continue to honor her, to remember her, to embody her strength and her knowledge, and to carry on. So let's get into it. In this first segment, Karen talks about how she got into the movement back in the 1980s and how she started UPC and the story of Viva, the very first chicken that she ever rescued, and also what she learned about chickens from living closely with them for decades. Are you there?
Hello.
You there, Karen?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Hope. I'm right here.
Wonderful. All right. So let's just start off. Why don't you just tell us a little about yourself? What led you to launch United Poultry Concerns 30 years ago? Of course, this year is United Poultry Concerns 30-year anniversary, 2020. So how did the animal advocacy leaders respond to the idea of you creating an organization for chickens and turkeys? How did this all begin?
Well, in the 1980s, I became very interested in what was just then becoming the animal rights movement. The whole Washington, D.C. metro area was a hotbed of activism in the mid-1980s. It was also a time when the animal advocacy movement was starting to pay some attention to farmed animals, which previously had been ignored, and particularly in the United States. So I began reading a lot about animal rights. There was actually quite a lot of literature by that time, and I started attending organizational meetings and demonstrations and things that were taking place in the Washington metro area. And I did a volunteer internship at the new organization at the time called Farm Sanctuary, which was then located in Pennsylvania. And it was my experience at Farm Sanctuary meeting the chickens and the turkeys and the ducks and the geese, although I loved meeting all of the animals who were brand new to me, the pigs, the sheep, the goats. I did not know these animals growing up, but I've had a lifelong affinity for birds. And so when I met these birds, so-called poultry, when I met these birds, and particularly the chickens, I was just so drawn to them. And getting to know them in a personal way every day as a volunteer intern. I actually lived at Farm Sanctuary for 5 weeks the summer of, I believe it was 1985 or 6. I just began to feel that I would love to start an organization that would focus on the plight and the delight of birds who are considered a food source for human beings, particularly chickens and turkeys. So I continued my reading, including historical accounts of how cultures and societies have kept these birds, which is a very unhappy story, I can tell you right now, long before factory farming per se got started in the mid 20th century. And I began to feel that even though I was studying to get my PhD degree in English literature, which I completed in 1987, but by that time I was really deeply immersed in the animal advocacy activities. And I began to veer away more from the idea of going out to look for work in university or college, and more about what I could do in the animal advocacy community and make that my life work. So my experience at Farm Sanctuary followed by my then husband and I, Alan Kate, moving to a little house that we rented outside Washington, D.C., in a little wooded area on a dirt road. There, I discovered that our landlady was keeping a flock of about 100 chickens for her agricultural tax break. And when I discovered these chickens by accident one June day in 1985, I used to start to visit them in the afternoons. I would sometimes take a book or a magazine and I would read, and they would all gather around me. And I was just very, very moved by them, and I would stroke their feathers sometimes, and they really seemed to appreciate the attention. Well, after about 2 weeks of that, I also noticed how huge they were. And I was just then learning about how chickens bred for the meat industry are forced to grow many times larger and faster than a normal chicken would. And these chickens exemplified that information. So I saw how huge they became in such a short amount of time. But one day I went down to visit them and they were gone. And about a day later, I walked by the little shed again and I saw some movement inside. And so I carefully opened the door and I went to the back where I had seen this shadowy movement. And there was a little hen who had been left behind, either on purpose or because she just had been overlooked. She was very small. She was very crippled. Her eyes were very dim and unfocused, and she looked like the saddest little creature. So I gathered her up in my arms and I took her into our kitchen and I set her carefully down on the kitchen floor on a nice little blanket. And my husband, Alan Kate, looked at her and he said, "Well, we should call her Viva because she is the only one who lived." So she became Viva the chicken hen. And two things I say about her in the article that I subsequently wrote about her and that appears on our homepage on our website is how she was so crippled, but she wanted to be able to run. And she would go through this painstaking ordeal to be able to walk on her wingtips. And then she would walk and run on her wingtips because her legs were so lame and crippled. And then she would collapse in a heap and she would be exhausted. And she would wait a while and then she would commence the whole effort to be able to walk on her wingtips again. The other thing about her, well, everything I loved about her, but the other thing was how when I would be petting her feathers and stroking her under her chin and showing her that kind of affection, she would actually purr like a little kitten, like a little, and it was clear that she was contented and happy and felt comforted. And I had no idea that a chicken purred, or really, knew so little about chickens. But my experience with Viva in particular, plus my experience with at Farm Sanctuary, plus my learning about the fact that chickens are far and away the 98 or more % of all land animals being raised and slaughtered for food, those things came together to cause me to decide in the late 1990s that I wanted to start an organization that would be devoted to educating people on behalf of chickens, turkeys, and other domesticated fowl. I wanted an organization that would be an advocacy group for these birds. And so I, of course, debated about what to call the organization. I was going to call it Chicken Liberation America, and I had all these different names that I ran by people. And eventually I settled on United Poultry Concerns because I wanted a more corporate sounding, less obvious sounding title at the time. In particular, I wanted to be able to get some specific information from poultry industry meetings and poultry industry representatives. And I thought that having a more corporate sounding title would enable me to accomplish that goal. And I believe I turned out to be correct about that. I did ask some people, some leaders in the animal advocacy movement at the time in the late 1980s, what they thought about my starting an organization focusing on chickens and turkeys. And I got two distinctly different answers. One group of people said that this type of organization would never succeed because, as one person said to me, we can't even get people to care about whales. How are we ever going to get people to care about chickens? And then the other group of people said, you should do it and you should do it now. Don't wait, do it now. Now, I was going to start this organization regardless of what kind of advice I received because I'd already made up my mind. But I was very interested in the responses that I received. And I started United Poultry Concerns officially in 1990. And my attitude toward those who said to me that an organization focusing on chickens and turkeys would never fly was that, you know, the whole idea of animal advocacy is to try to use your skills and abilities to persuade people to care about these birds. People who think they don't care or who never even gave a chicken or a turkey any thought at all, to discover that when the information about these birds is presented to them in a moving and informative way, that we could get their attention, because that assumes that people have the capacity to care about animals once they are presented with the message in the right way. So I operated then and continue to do so to this day on the basis of the belief that most people do have a sympathetic nerve, if you will, and are capable of caring about chickens and other animals they may feel initially that they will never care about. And I have found that that's true. So I did start United Poultry Concerns in 1990, and I never looked back. Having been engaged with chickens and turkeys on a daily basis since the mid-1980s, I have come to know them about as well as one can get to know the members of another species of animal. And it doesn't take a rocket science to discover within a few days pretty much what chickens like to do. First of all, they like to be active. They like to run, they like to walk, they like to jump up on tree branches and other kinds of perches. They like to be busy. They're very, very vibrant birds. They want to run around the yard. They love it when you throw out almost any kind of treat for them, they will come running, and they're all excited and cheerful and happy about almost everything. And one thing I discovered about chickens very quickly was how cheerful they really are. I mean, they seem to be happy in just about any type of weather, including snow or rain, or certainly they love sunshine. And they love to take, speaking of sunshine, they love to take sun baths. And they will flop down on the ground, and they will spread out one wing on one side and soak up the sun that way, and then they'll turn their body around, and then they'll soak up that side of their body, and they raise their feathers from their body so that the sunlight will soak into their skin, and they need that sunlight for vitamin D3. So it's a blissful experience for them, and they totally enjoy that sunlight, and they will seek out the sunlight on cold winter days when the days are short, but they will follow the sun in the yard. And it also is part of their hygiene practice. The other thing that chickens particularly love to do is to take dust baths. And for a chicken and a turkey, a dust bath is comparable to a water bath for human beings. There are some types of birds like starlings who I watch take both dirt baths, and sparrows also. They take both dirt baths and water baths in puddles and things. But chickens and turkeys take dust baths. And what they will do is they will sink down into the ground, onto the ground, and they will make a dust bowl. And they will scratch with their claws, and they will use their beaks to get the earth to fly up in all directions and to settle into their skin. And those earthy particles actually help to remove debris that has built up in their skin. And it's kind of like when we scrub our own skin, or when we vigorously comb our own hair, that we are sloughing off old skin cells and getting rid of any type of debris that has lodged there. And we're cleaning our body. And so to see chickens with such earthy pleasures and such a very earthy needs be locked up in cages or in confinement facilities where they are deprived of sunlight, where they are deprived of earth in which to sunbathe, on which to take a dust bath, and simply to run around, because their feet, their legs, their whole anatomy and physiology are all designed to be on the earth itself, not to be on standing on metal or on wires or bars or anything else, all of which causes them a great deal of pain and can lead to lameness and all kinds of problems. Well, most of us are now familiar with what we have come to call factory farming, where you have many thousands of birds locked up in a confinement facility. If they're being bred for the meat industry, they can't even move. They grow so fast and so large in just a few short weeks as a result of the artificial breeding they've been subjected to. And pretty soon they're just beak to beak. They're lame because they've grown so fast that their skeletal system can't keep up with the growth of their muscles, and they go to slaughter basically crippled in almost every case. And then the hens bred for the egg industry are a smaller type of chicken. All of their brothers are destroyed by being ground up alive at birth, or asphyxiated with carbon dioxide, or actually electrocuted. But the hens who are used for egg production, the majority in this country and worldwide, are in battery cages. They're in little tiny cages that are stacked up high and go in a building as farther than the eye can see, not only because these buildings are so long, 600 feet long sometimes, and because the air is so dense with contaminants that there's always a haze in the air. So that also makes it more difficult to see to the very end of these long buildings, which are nothing but a universe of cages filled with tortured hens. Even these so-called cage-free operations, the birds are still very crowded. They're really deprived of things to do. I will read poultry industry literature, which still has articles about how, well, why is it that chickens will peck at each other in the cage-free operation, or even why do they peck at each other? Why can they be driven to peck each other in the cage? Well, it's because chickens evolved their beaks and their claws and their whole body to forage in the soil. That is, they dig in the soil in order to find their food. So that's the purpose of their beak, and to explore the environment. So they have a beak for a specific purpose, and that is to survive and to thrive by finding food with their beak. And then they scratch the soil to be able to unearth, well, it could be earthworms, it could be micronutrients, it could be little kinds of bugs that are in the soil. But they have these bodily structures for a purpose that they evolved in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia and the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. And so when they are put in an environment like a cage or a confinement facility with nothing but machines running and nothing to do with their energies and with the patterns of behavior that define them as chickens, then they become restless, they become bored, and they start picking at whatever they can pick at, because everything they're surrounded by, except for each other, is either metal or mash. And mash will never satisfy a chicken's desire to eat, because chickens' beaks and chickens themselves are designed to pull and peck at things and yank leaves and yank at grass and so on. So they have all these inborn needs that, despite all the breeding that has been done to them for specific agribusiness traits, has in no way changed the fundamental nature of the chicken, or the turkey for that matter. And even cage-free operations, which I've visited personally several times, they're just very barren places. The chickens cannot fulfill their nature and have the kind of life they would choose to have in any of these kinds of places. When we get to know chickens and turkeys and ducks, of course, and guinea fowl and others, when we get to know who they are, what they like to do, what defines them as a particular type of creature, then when we see their sad faces and the fear and lusterlessness in their eyes, and all of which you can read when you look at them, and you can see their misery, you begin to understand the quality and the intensity of the misery they're experiencing, because their suffering isn't just suffering, it's unnatural suffering. It's suffering that they would never encounter in the natural world. Yes, they might be preyed upon by various predators, but there is nothing like chronic daily misery being inflicted upon these birds or other animals as human beings do in all segments of farming.
In this next part, Karen talks about the psychological suffering of chickens beyond the physical suffering. Let's listen.
Well, I know just from living with chickens since starting in 1985, I've written extensively about what I've observed in the chickens with whom I interact every day. And if anybody wants the best article about chickens, in my opinion, it's my article called The Mental Life of Chickens, or The Social Life of Chickens, which appeared in an anthology about animals. I think it was in 2011. And it's on our website under the category Thinking Like a Chicken, in which I talk about how chickens are so aware of their surroundings. They are so cognizant of everything that's going on around them. And certainly the kinds of suffering they endure is not only the physical suffering that they endure if they are in an inimical environment, which does not answer to any of their needs or any of the behaviors that are part of their genetic nature. I mean, they have a genetic nature that is responsive to, or that feels the deprivation of the things they need. I mean, a chicken didn't just evolve to live in trees. The trees and the tree limbs and the rich soil and the foraging for food and the normal socializing and all of the things, and the nesting and the raising of their chicks, all of these activities that they do externally are embedded internally in who they are. And so, as we've been discussing, that a chicken isn't only experiencing, for example, painful physical disorders as they do in factory farms, which is reported on extensively in farmed animal literature. I mean, there's no secret about it. The farmed animal journals and magazines and science journals, they all talk about all of these diseases, these man-made diseases, which don't occur in chickens in nature. They describe them, they describe what they call emerging diseases, the anatomical anomalies that have become embedded in the genome of the chicken, in the genetic nature of the chicken. These are all implanted there by human beings, by chicken experimenters. And then these chickens end up in the chicken houses and in the slaughterhouses and ultimately in people's mouths and stomachs. But chickens are whole beings as we are. Their minds are well developed. They have been shown to have very complex cognitive abilities. Mother hens can suffer over seeing their chicks being in a distressful situation. She runs and tries to help them. And I can just give one quick example from our sanctuary. A couple of years ago, it turned out that one of our hens rescued from a cockfighting raid, because cockfighters keep hens to lay the eggs that become the roosters who they torture and fight. We took in 50 chickens from this raid in Virginia Beach in 2018. Well, in 2019, in May, it turned out that even though we are scrupulous about gathering all of our birds' eggs, so we don't want them to be reproducing in a sanctuary where we want to have a home for those who already need a home. But lo and behold, I discovered that one of those hens, so-called game hens, when I saw what looked like an egg under her that I was going to snatch up, I went to grab that egg and there was movement under her body. And it turned out she had 5 newborn baby chicks under her. So, okay, on the one hand, I was distressed. On the other hand, I was kind of thrilled because it was just so wonderful to see a mother hen actually have a chance to be a mother hen and to see these brand new born baby chicks. Shortly after that, we discovered that those baby chicks were so small that they could get through the wires that surround our predator-proof enclosure, and that they would end up on the other side among all the weeds and things there. And so we had to keep grabbing them, and they would be chirping distressfully, and the mother hen would be going almost crazy that her baby chicks were out of her reach, that she could not help them and she could not reach them. And at one point, when I got close to her to reassure her, we did get all the baby chicks out of there, by the way, and we fixed the lower part of the fence so they couldn't get out of there again. But meanwhile, on that Saturday morning, I got close to her to reassure her, and she was so distressed that she jumped up and with her claws and she scraped my face, not as a matter of aggression toward me personally, but just that she was so distressed that she did not have her chicks, that she could not control what was happening to them. So I saw firsthand how distressed a mother hen can become when she cannot get her chicks. So this is an example of a direct emotional response from a mother hen who wants to reach her chicks and who is desperate to help them and to not let them experience any peril. So the fact is that, again, numerous experiments have been done to show that chickens experience empathy, that they relate in a cordial and empathic way to one another. But again, I see these realities acted out every day in our sanctuary. So chickens know. I remember once hearing somebody say, well, chickens, this was actually an animal welfare person of all things, but he was saying, well, there's no real evidence that a chicken has a sense of the future. And I'm like, well, that's nuts. Of course they do. I mean, first of all, a sense of the future and a sense of the past are intimately connected. You want to be in a place that you've already experienced and you want to go back to it. Or on the other hand, you want to avoid a place you've experienced as a bad place, and you try to avoid that place. So you either want to get into a place that you remember as having been a happy place, and now you anticipate and want to get back into it, or if it was a terrible place or a terrible human being for that matter, or other type of predator, you do everything you can to avoid that predator or that terrible place. And so memory and expectation are intimately connected. And I've seen it enacted time and time again in our chickens and in our turkeys. So the idea that chickens don't have a memory, they don't anticipate, they don't plan. Well, why do they make nests if they don't have any plans?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a really good point. Karen and I both shared a dislike for the term voice for the voiceless that's so often used in the animal rights movement. And while we both understood the sentiment, of course, it has good intentions, but animals have voices, complex, varied voices. And Karen often talked about this. And here she talks about chickens' vocalizations and the importance of listening to their voices and how chickens can purr. And she has this really sweet story of a chicken who comforted her in a time of sorrow. This is a really lovely section. I know you're going to enjoy this one.
We are the voice of the voiceless. And I have said, and some others, and I'm sure you have said, these animals are not voiceless.
Yeah.
Animals have voices. What I say is we are their voice, capital V, in the world of human beings, other human beings. We have to be their political voice. We have to be their vicarious voice. Yes. We have to speak for them in the human domain, but they are not voiceless themselves. And they have many, many ways of communicating amongst themselves, as well as with other species, including ourselves. And they have ways with their voices telling us how they feel, whether they feel good or bad, or they're frustrated or distressed or happy or satisfied. So I don't like any language that, however well intended or just simply kind of used by rote, I don't like language that in any way misrepresents or denigrates the members, the individuals of other species. I mean, I don't like language that denigrates anybody, whether they be human or otherwise, but to continue calling other animals voiceless is just, it's incorrect. And it's unfair to them because it's not true. They're not voiceless, and we shouldn't be saying that anymore. We need to, always out of movement, we need to be more conscious of our language. Chickens don't just cluck. They do cluck, but it's not, even the word cluck doesn't quite describe the nuances of vocalizations that I hear in our chickens constantly. Roosters crow. They crow in the very early morning hours when for us it's still dark out, because chickens see infrared light, therefore they see the sunlight 45 minutes to an hour before we do. So in their tropical forest habitats, which they've carried over into all of their domestic situations, roosters will start crowing when it's still dark out, because for them it's no longer dark. It's now the sun is up, coming up. So that's when they like to jump down from their tree branches and start scurrying around the floor of the forest and foraging for their food and exploring and doing all the things that chickens love to do in the early morning and again in the evening, especially before they settle down to roost at night. But you see chickens and you hear chickens, there are many voices. I can't really imitate them, so I'm not going to do a poor imitation of what is really such a charming and vigorous and sometimes very quiet clucking and cooing and all of the different voices of the birds. Of course, in the afternoon, they love to sit under the trees quietly. Certainly, they are just very expressive. And at night, since we have a 12,000 square foot predator-proof enclosure that includes the trees and bushes that the chickens love, it's wonderful to hear the chickens assemble themselves and get settled down, which takes an hour or more, usually more, in the trees and the bushes at night. because this isn't something where each one just jumps up onto their tree branch and that's the end of it. They just have this commotion. There's a lot of commotion. You can actually hear the tree branches rustling around, and you hear them just getting ready for the night. And then the rooster will jump up. Kalua is one of our roosters. He jumps up there at night, and there's a lot of commotion. And then there comes a moment when suddenly there is no longer a sound, and they're totally quiet until the next morning. And, one of the really cute things is that we have a little bathroom on the first floor here. And if you look outside that bathroom window, there's a big bush there. And it's one of the big bushes that several of our hens and our rooster Kalua likes to perch in for the night. And so I go in there, let's say maybe around 7 o'clock, just to say hi to the hens. And the rooster isn't up there yet, but the hens start coming up there. And when I look at them through the window, and there they are, they're right next to me, and they're looking in, and their eyes are focused on me. And chickens have excellent eyesight, much better than we do, both distance and close up and everything in between. They have excellent hearing. And so it makes sense that birds who have excellent hearing would also have voices. And as I once read by a person who was very well acquainted with chickens, he said, well, remember that chickens come from the dense tropical forests. And when they break up into small groups during the day, they can't always see each other because of all the foliage. So he says they have to develop a way to be able to communicate with one another as social animals who want to keep tabs on what's going on and communicate. So they develop through nature very, very good hearing. And so chickens are among the many, many tropical forest dwellers, monkeys and parrots and so on, who not only have extremely loud voices, as we all know, but also have excellent hearing. That way they can call to each other, communicate with one another, locate one another, and send information and receive information through their ears. So it makes sense that creatures who have excellent ears would also have voices that run the gamut from extremely loud and piercing to very quiet, very soft. And I have described how chickens, sometimes when you hold them close to you, will, and I mean very close to your chest, to your neck, and to your face, and stroke their head and their body and under their chin, their faces are very, very sensitive. And so they will start to purr like a cat almost. They'll go, purr, purr. And it is the sweetest sound in the world. And many years ago, when I had a large white hen rescued from a horrible, one of those farmers markets in Northern Virginia, her name was Sonia. We named her Sonia. She was a very happy hen, and she was very, very sensitive, and I would say very empathic toward me. I mean, she was very aware of me. And one day, a terrible thing happened where a fox killed one of our chickens. That doesn't happen now because we've enclosed our whole predator-proof yard here. But a fox killed our little rooster, Josie. And I sat on the floor in the living room because she was in the living room with me. And I just started to cry. And I was so distressed. And she plodded over on her big, heavy legs. And she just kind of wrapped her face in my neck and hair. And she just started purring and purring and purring. And as I told a reporter once for an article that appeared in the Washington Post, and this was the end of the article, it ended on that note. I described that and I said, I wished I could have stayed in that moment forever. Aww. And that's how moved I was by Sonia's. She knew I was sad. I don't know if she knew why I was sad, but the point is she picked up on my emotion and she came over, she plodded over from where she was to comfort me physically. And her little voice was just so, well, it was comforting.
That's so beautiful. I love that story. This next segment is something I always loved when Karen would talk about. She talks about chickens having earth rights. It's such a beautiful concept. Let's listen.
By earth rights, I mean that chickens and all animals have a right to experience the earthly satisfactions that they evolved in nature to enjoy. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be happy and they're always going to be safe, because that's not how the natural world works. But it means that chickens, like all animals, have a genetic patterning within themselves that enables them and invites them to do things and experience things that are consistent with who they are, who they want to be, and what they want to do. And I think that one of the terrible things that we do to chickens and other animals whom we incarcerate, hold captive, and so on, is to deny them the opportunity that they have a right to experience, which is the opportunity for their earth rights to be on the earth in a way that suits their nature and brings to them the ultimate potential that they have and want to unfold when they are free to do so and not being prevented by their captors, by their captivity, by their incarceration. So I believe we all have earth rights, you might say. So humans seem to not want to take much advantage of their earth rights quite often, but chickens definitely want to. And one thing that I have seen in the many decades that I have been keeping and caring for chickens since 1985 is how ready they are, even if they've never known anything but a battery cage, an industrial compound, or some such experience, how ready they are to be on the earth, to experience the ground and the sunshine and the trees and the natural life that, again, isn't just an environment surrounding them, but really which is an internal environment, something which is alive and ready to be activated within themselves.
An inherent quality, something that
Exactly.
they feel. Yeah, I love that.
It's an inherent quality that can either be unfolded and realized, or that can be inhibited and frustrated.
Karen, of course, loved all birds, and here she talks about the plight of wild birds and the decrease of wild bird populations and how their numbers are being replaced with farmed birds.
Actually, it is a terrible situation that wild birds are enduring because of human activity, and human activity, particularly animal farming, the expansion of animal farming, the erosion of habitat to grow more and more soybeans, in part to feed factory farm chickens, and of course, to graze cows, and just all of human activity. But certainly agribusiness is one of the biggest causes of the loss of habitat, the erosion of habitat that birds need, wild birds need, in order to not only survive, but to thrive. So right now, Wild Bird International in 2018 reported that over 40% of all birds on the planet are in serious decline. So that's a terrible statistic to think about. And it's a situation that Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, published in 1962, used as a kind of barometer of how our pollution, our chemical industry particularly, is causing the decline of wild birds whose songs and whose presence used to be everywhere in the United States and other parts of the world. And now there are whole areas where they once were very, very prominent and active. You don't hear a single bird. So now the situation has become more dire as a result of human activity. And at the same time, because of human activity, the number of domesticated chickens has grown exponentially. And the article in The Economist called Chickenomics, how chicken became the world's most popular meat. And it explains that the total mass of farmed chickens exceeds that of all other birds on the planet combined.
Wow.
And as I continue to explain what was meant here, this news comprises two very important facts. One is the number and the size, the body size of chickens suffering for food worldwide. So it's their numbers and just that they blow up to such an abnormally huge size in 6 or 5 weeks, and then they're slaughtered. And the second fact comprised in this statistic is the disappearance of wild birds from the world, as I just described. So we're seeing a terrible set of conditions that are interrelated. The suffering of the chickens in factory farm operations and the just disappearance of free living birds. And of course, when we talk about the disappearance of free living birds, we're also talking about just the suffering they endure in not being able to use their migratory landing spaces, for example, in 8 parts of Asia and other places. How they suffer in having so many of their eggs no longer being hatchable because of all of the contamination and pollution and the toxins that human activity has proliferated around the globe. So birds, both chickens in the factory farms and the free living birds, are both telling an interrelated story of the horror of humanity's behavior on the earth, where birds and other animals are concerned.
Karen was very knowledgeable about turkeys as well, and she wrote a book about turkeys. And every fall, UPC's attention would turn to the turkeys because of the holiday meals focused on turkey meat. 45 million turkeys will be killed in November and December in the US. This will be the first Thanksgiving in decades without Karen here to speak out for the turkeys. And I can't help but feel the significance of that. I think that it must be relieving for her to not have to go through these holidays ever again. I hope that she can rest and have peace in the knowledge that we will continue to speak out for the turkeys for her, in her name and in her honor. Here's Karen talking about turkeys.
The turkey has a very interesting history. Certainly, the turkey is native to the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere. They apparently did not exist in Europe or Asia, unlike the chicken or the peafowl, for example. They are known to be an American bird. And so when the Europeans started coming to this continent in the 16th century, they saw turkeys everywhere in New England, on the Great Plains, in Mexico, South America, Central America. They were everywhere, living and raising their families, and there were just thousands and thousands of turkeys in the 16th, 17th century. And then, of course, before that, before the Europeans actually arrived on these shores. And there were also many turkeys found in various stages of fossilization, I guess you'd say, indicating how they had been used by various Native American nations. The turkeys lived essentially large, free lives, roaming about in the woods. They loved the meadows. They occupied just about any landscape. Many people are surprised to learn that not only do turkeys walk and run, they fly 50 miles an hour, they can run up to 12 miles an hour, and they swim. turkeys are good swimmers, both when they're very young and as adults, and they can swim a mile or so across a water bed. So that's how they lived until the Europeans came. And once the Europeans came, the turkeys were really just decimated over time until the beginning of the 20th century, when the turkey was in danger of being exterminated by the Europeans, because they would get their muskets out or whatever weaponry they had and shoot them, for example, in the trees at dusk, when the turkeys would, in huge flocks up to a mile wide, the trees would be just filled with turkeys roosting for the night, starting at dusk. And the settlers and military troops and other assorted travelers would get out their muskets or their other firearms, and they would just blast them away, and then they would leave them there. Or sometimes they would fill their wagons with them, take them somewhere, but they often just left them there because they shot them strictly for sport. And even today we'll hear about turkey shoots, live turkey shoots, still apparently being conducted in some parts of rural America. These kinds of practices were routinely practiced by the Europeans, and they just shot them all the time. And then in addition, because turkeys would eat the corn or eat the wheat, in the Midwest, for example, whole communities would get together and they would beat the turkeys to death. They would shoot them and in various ways seek intentionally to exterminate them, to protect their fields of corn and wheat from the turkeys. So the turkeys were really assaulted on all sides by every type of weaponry by the Europeans, so that, as I mentioned, by the late 19th, early 20th century, they were on the verge of extermination. And it was around that time that Fish and Wildlife, or whatever its counterpart was at that time, US Fish and Wildlife, they began to systematically use the domesticated turkeys, who were, of course, derived from the wild turkeys, to repopulate turkeys. And all kinds of crossbreeding and inbreeding and penning up the turkeys and artificial insemination, all kinds of methods were used to regenerate a population of wild turkeys. And while that seems like a great idea, unfortunately, the main reason for wanting to revive these populations of turkeys was for turkey hunting, which included and continues to this day to include just sport hunting, as well as shooting turkeys for so-called food. I didn't know anything about turkeys until I went to work at Farm Sanctuary, and then subsequently began to do an enormous amount of reading about them, which ultimately led me to decide to write More Than a Meal: The Turkey in History, Myth, Ritual, and Reality. And I have to say that one of the things that led me to become interested in turkeys in the 1980s was the way they were mocked and ridiculed in the mainstream media. And I subsequently learned in my research that turkeys have for a long time been considered figures of fun, that there's something about their personalities and the way they look, and turkeys have very visible moods. Their faces and those wrinkly, bumpy faces and heads of theirs can turn red and mulberry colored and blue and white depending on the mood they're in. And if they get into an angry mood and they're all red and angry looking, I guess you could say there's something comical about the way they look at you. But turkeys were denigrated and laughed at. And by the time I was reading about them, particularly in the early 1990s, I would notice that every single year in the Washington Post, in the run-up to Thanksgiving, you would read articles about turkeys that just made fun of them, that just slandered them, that particularly insisted that they were stupid, they were dirty, and making fun of their sex life, which really the writers didn't even know anything about. But it just seemed like there needed to be a contrast to the piety and solemnity of Thanksgiving that turned out to be the turkey, who was created as this mock figure of fun and denigration. So my own experience with turkeys, first at Farm Sanctuary and then in our sanctuary, was what an interesting bird they are. I remember, and I start More Than a Meal with my profile of Milton the turkey, who was a very large, arthritic, bronze turkey at Farm Sanctuary, who loved to be around people, human beings, because I consider other animals to be people too. So he loved to be around human beings. He would follow a person, a human being, around the barnyard. He had very gouty, arthritic legs, and he was extremely heavy. I don't know, he weighed 40, 50 pounds by the time I met him. But he was interested in people and things, and he would follow you around. And I have told the story often about how one day a man came to visit the sanctuary, and it was my job to show him around the sanctuary, including going through the barn and introducing him to the various animals. So we were walking around, and this man said something to the effect of, "I stopped eating red meat, but I still eat chicken and turkey," which people still say, believe it or not, 30 years later. So we kept walking and talking, and occasionally we would stop for a minute or two and we'd pause. And then gradually this man started looking down, and there would be Milton, who would be walking beside us. And then when we would stop and pause for a few seconds or so, Milton would stop with us. And the man became more and more interested in just Milton. And the fact that Milton was interested in us and was following us and stopping when we stopped and starting when we started. And finally he said, I didn't know that turkeys could, and he couldn't think of a word that he was trying to use that would describe what he was seeing in Milton. And I later wrote that I think what he was trying to say was be companionable. It was like he was saying, I didn't know turkeys had consciousness, or that they knew anything, or that they were companionable.
Yeah.
And it certainly had an effect upon him, that experience. But he was certainly struck by Milton's attentiveness to us and Milton's obvious desire to accompany us on our little tour. So another thing that struck me about turkeys, particularly the female turkeys, the hens, was how I would be cleaning up. I'd have a big broom and I'd be cleaning up, and one of the female turkeys would just sit down right where I was working. And I would stop what I'm doing and I would kneel down and I would start petting her back and under her wings and under her beak. And I mean, she just would never have moved if I hadn't moved first. Her body was so sensitive to being touched, to being stroked and petted. They love to be touched. Some chickens like that too. Others aren't as fond of it, but there's no question that they are very sensuous birds, and they certainly respond to being stroked and patted, and just about anything that you would do that would not be harmful or hurtful to their bodies. I think it's really important when we talk about the cognitive abilities of other animals other than human, that we recognize the fact that all animals are intelligent. If they weren't intelligent, they wouldn't survive. So the cognitive abilities of turkeys, like other animals, includes their ancestral knowledge, which they have evolved through centuries and longer to have, their personal experience and the intelligence that they bring to bear based upon the novel experiences that they encounter in their own personal lives. And then in the case of the turkey hens, if they are so fortunate as to have young, their baby turkeys, their maternal instincts. And a mother turkey is deeply maternal. She knows exactly how to care for her young in a way that is going to protect them in the best possible way. And this protective knowledge is evident when, for example, she begins to search out her nesting place. And it's been pointed out by various people who have had turkeys under one circumstance or another, how very smart turkey hens are in locating a nesting place on the ground, because turkeys, like chickens, are what they call ground nesting birds. They don't make nests in trees, they make nests on the ground. So because that makes them very vulnerable to predators, they have to locate a place that will be secluded, that will be camouflaged, that will also be near enough to water. So they are very adept at locating exactly the kind of nesting spot that will meet all of their needs to protect their eggs, to protect themselves sitting on the eggs, and that will also allow them to be able to get off the nest, to be able to drink water, and so on. They will sit on the eggs for about 26 days. And then toward the end of those 26 days, the baby turkeys under them, with whom they have been in direct communication for almost the entire time that the baby turkeys were embryos. The mother turkey and her young, as embryos, are in constant contact, and the embryos are in constant contact with one another. So that by the time the baby turkeys are ready to hatch, the whole family knows one another because they've been in constant auditory contact.
Like
So
vocalizing to each other,
vocalization,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
they have vocalized. And the mother turkey, when she's sitting on her nest with her young under her breast feathers, knows when a turkey baby will notify her that it is too cold and needs warmed up a little bit more, or too warm, or too humid, or whatever condition the baby turkey is experiencing that is a bit uncomfortable, that the mother turkey needs to adjust how she's sitting on her eggs. So this goes on constantly when the mother turkey is sitting on the eggs. So it isn't just nothing's going on there. It is a constant activity, constant communication is taking place. And then the turkeys begin to saw themselves out of their eggs, making a circle around the egg. The baby turkey emerges from the egg, all wet, very vulnerable. So it takes about 24 hours for all of the viable turkeys to be ready to go on a march with the mother turkey, to begin to explore the ground for food, to begin to get their exercise and to learn their environment, all of which the mother turkey is teaching the baby turkeys. And they're just an interested family group. They're interested in everything in the environment. They check everything out, and they keep in constant contact. And then at night, at dusk, I should say, they go up into the trees, and the mother turkey, who has huge, amazing wings, will encircle the baby turkeys on the left side and on the right side of the tree limb or the tree branch and keep them safe for the night. And we have the most wonderful, beautiful photograph of a mother turkey on a tree limb with all of her turkey poults. They're actually called poults, Poults, baby turkeys. And it was a beautiful image that once I saw it in a magazine, I just had to have that picture. And we've used it in so much of our literature. And surprisingly, perhaps not surprisingly, I've met many people along the way who said, well, what kind of a bird is that? Because many people in the animal advocacy movement, for example, are so used to only seeing a factory farm full of crowded white turkeys, and of course not with in any kind of family life situation, that to see a mother turkey like that, all with her beautiful, gorgeous, glistening beige, brown, and golden feathers, and her young under her, and just the whole family scene, that they don't know what kind of bird that is. Well, she's a turkey. One thing I would emphasize is what I have just been describing about the mother turkey and her young, and about Milton the turkey, and the cognitive combination of their ancestral memories, their parental instincts, and their personal learned knowledge and behavior, and to realize that this is all part of their mental and emotional repertoire. All of this persists in them when they are rounded up and living in a confinement building where they're totally crowded by the many hundreds in a building, just like chickens and other birds who are used as a food source. The breeding flocks, or the parent flocks, are, well, in the case of turkeys, the flocks don't actually live together in terms of males and females. Chicken flocks, you have like 10 female chickens to every one rooster living in the same house or the same breeding house or flock. But turkeys have been bred to be so extremely heavy and malformed that the natural mating of them can no longer happen. So male turkeys are masturbated by human men who obscenely masturbate them to the point of getting them to produce semen, which they gather up in syringes or vials. So then these vials or these syringes are taken to where the female turkeys, adult turkeys, are housed separately, and they are tied down and they are artificially inseminated by human male workers. Now, this is such a humiliating experience for these birds. There's nothing in their natural evolution that could make any sense out of being treated this way. And it is so disturbing to these very heavy birds who have been bred to be so heavy, 30, 40 pounds or so, speaking of the breeding flocks, sometimes even heavier, that they can easily have heart attacks. The vessels in their breast muscles simply are deprived of oxygen and they have heart attacks. But those who manage to get through this horrible process of being artificially masturbated and then artificially inseminated, and then ultimately they're sent to slaughter, and then because they're big and heavy and their breast muscle or so-called meat is very tough because they're older, their flesh is then the kind that goes into soups and sausages and highly processed foods like that. The same as with chickens. So then the eggs go into these huge hatcheries, into incubator drawers. You have these big incubators which are filled with drawers, the same as with chickens. And after 25 or 26 days, the eggs begin to hatch. I remember thinking one day about these baby chicks, turkey chicks or poults, in these incubator drawers, and how the lost turkey out in the fields or the meadow, who suddenly realizes he has become separated from his family, gives out what has been described as a lost call. He gives out a lost call for his family. And I thought one day about how all these baby turkeys, as well as chickens in these mechanical incubator drawers, they give out a lost call to a parent who will never respond to them. Mm. And when you think about that, that's such a horrible thought to realize, again, the experiences, the patterns of experience that are embedded in their natures, the expectations that they have, that will never be able to be expressed, that will never be answered. So there they are.
I just want to say that's really an interesting thought that I hadn't ever really considered until just now. Because when you were talking about that, the lost call in the field with the mother turkey, I started thinking about a kid like in a grocery store that gets lost and cries, and the mother's frantically looking, and then they reunite, and it's similar to that, but what you're saying now, these turkeys in the incubators, in the hatcheries, they're orphans. They will never have that joy of reuniting with the family and that comfort and security of that feeling. They're constantly in that state of feeling lost and alone.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And Hope, when you read the poultry science or poultry industry literature, they're describing the loneliness of these turkeys and the anxiety they have when finally, after they go through the so-called service rooms, how lost they are in not having their mother. Yeah. They often starve to death because they need their mother to help them to learn about eating. But essentially, they are in such an alien situation. There they are, all plunked down by the hundreds or thousands, all baby turkeys, no mother, no one to comfort them except each other and each other's feathers. And they are lost, and they are lost for life. Mm. And again, I think it's very difficult for us to imagine a lifetime of being lost in that way, to have those expectations embedded in their nature that will never, ever be answered and satisfied. But let me briefly describe how once these turkeys, all of the viable turkeys, hatch in the incubator drawers in these hatcheries, then they are thrown down these chutes. They go into the part of the hatchery where they are separated into male and female. They have their beaks burned off. They have their toes amputated, and there's a fleshy part of their face above their beaks called a snood that is also cut off, so that they are mutilated as soon as they're born on the first day of their lives. And when they have been debeaked and detoed and had to have their snood removed and all of that, they are, as one poultry scientist actually described in a turkey production magazine, he said they have been traumatized. That's their experience of waking up in the world. What is done to them on their first day of life, the pain, the suffering, the terror, they are traumatized. Mm. So now they are put in the crates, they go to the turkey houses and plunked out of the traits and, basically thrown on the floors. In the case of turkeys, it takes them 3 or 4 months to reach what they call slaughter weight. Many turkeys die of heart attacks when they see their fellow turkeys dying of a heart attack. Often that will cause other turkeys around them to have a heart attack too. Again, they're very fragile, and we have to realize the terrible things that have been done to their bodies to predispose them to heart attacks, to extreme respiratory distress, so that heart, lung illnesses and deaths are very, very common among these turkeys, the same as with the chickens who have been bred for meat. But they will actually, their sensitivities are so strong amongst each other that the death of one turkey has been described as causing other turkeys around them to have a heart attack right within the same time frame. And another part of all this terrible the dystopian experience that the bodies of these turkeys are enduring is that they are very disproportioned. So that between the disproportion of their internal organs, the forced rapid growth of their bodies, and then the enormous size, all of that makes them tend to be lame, make it difficult for them to walk. And then remember that their toes were all cut off in the hatchery. So they can't get a grip on the floor as they would if they had their toenails. So I know that from our sanctuary experience that when we have adopted turkeys from a turkey production background and they don't have their toenails, that just adds to the difficulty they have in walking normally. Turkeys are very intelligent, emotional, aware individuals. They love their lives when their lives are going right for them. They love their families. They love the earth. They will love you if you treat them well, and all of their behavior will show you how friendly, how affectionate they are toward you. And a number of years ago, when I was talking to my husband, who has since passed away, I said to him, I want to create a button that would have a really interesting slogan on it for turkeys. And I want something that's really catchy. And he said, well, how about "Don't Gobble Me"? And I said, well, that's great. Don't gobble me. That's it. That's what every turkey is saying to us. Stand back, don't gobble me. So let's remember that in the heart of every turkey is that plea: please, don't gobble me. Treat me with respect. Let me live my life. Don't gobble me.
In one of the episodes where I pulled all these from, I asked Karen if she had any final thoughts to share. And I think that this was a fitting segment to end on. It's one of her strongest messages to vegans and animal advocates, and that is to be strong and to be unwavering whenever we're speaking about the animals, to be caring and compassionate, but also to be unapologetic whenever we speak about animals. Let's listen.
Well, my final thought is always this. As animal activists, as animal advocates, we always want to be strong and confident in our advocacy. We want to speak with confidence about the animals and for the animals. We want to be stand-up people. We don't want to flinch and be anxious and shy. We don't want to scream and yell at people. That's not what we're about. We are not about blaming people, but we want to bring animals and we want to bring people into the fold of compassion and justice for our fellow creatures. So we want to be strong, we want to be confident, and we want to always keep the animals in mind when we're speaking. We want to never apologize. We do not want to adopt an apologetic mode where we say, well, I know a lot of people won't agree with me, or I know that you probably don't think this way, but don't ever start off a conversation that way. Be caring, show in the sound of your voice that this animal and what he or she is going through, that this is important, that it matters. So you want the feeling to be in your voice. And we also have to demonstrate that we know our subject, that we're informed. We never want to get to the place where we say, oh, I know I'm just speaking to the choir, or I already know all this, so I don't need to know anymore. Well, we can always learn more, and we always want to be open. We want to be educators, but to be educators, we have to undergo continuing education. We want to be the best activists we can. I mean, there's a sad sense in which I have to say, we are all the animals have. We belong to the species that has brought misery and sadness and sorrow into their lives. And we have, in my view, an obligation to, all the more for that reason, to be the most effective members of our species, to realize how important our job is in speaking strongly and effectively and knowledgeably and caringly to anybody who we can grab hold of, and always to listen to what they have to say. I mean, we're not there to give them a sermon, a lecture. But we want to talk with them, and we can do that, and we can learn to do that. We can learn to hear what they're about and what their concerns are. And I have found repeatedly at vegetarian festivals and just my numerous one-on-one conversations with people, that when you let people have a chance, most people, I believe, do care about animals, and you can really strike a chord in people that you didn't even expect you might strike. And so we never want to assume that nobody cares. We never want to have an attitude of foregone conclusionism when we interact with people, because that will infect the way we speak with them, and it will not bode well. We want to be positive, we want to be caring, and we want to learn how to develop the skills. And once you do that, you're like, hey, I did that pretty well. I'm going to try that again. And you build your confidence, and we can all do that. But I just underline that when you get discouraged, when you feel that your work is not proceeding fast enough, you want to keep in mind that every social justice effort is a very, very long slog. And we don't yet have social justice perfection at all, even in this country, as we well know. And the real effort to bring justice to animals and care for them and to liberate animals from the abuses that we impose upon them is still a very new phenomenon. It only goes back to about 1970. And now we're really, I believe, on a roll. And we need to keep our eyes focused on our goals. We need to keep our eyes focused on what we want to have happen in this world and that we want to help make happen in this world. And when you go to work, when you turn your feelings into productive activity, that helps you, and it helps the animals, and it makes the world a better place. So being an activist is it's a therapy for us. And it's a way of making the world that we want come closer every day.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. So UPC will live on. The birds at the sanctuary in Virginia are being cared for by the same loving people who have cared for them for many years. And the UPC board is looking for a sanctuary manager to live at the house with them full time. Lee Chin Chow, who's been on the UPC board for years, will be stepping into the role of president. Her and her husband, Franklin, have been at Karen's side for many, many years on the board of directors and helping her with outreach. So UPC will live on, and all of Karen's powerful writings will still be available on the UPC website. So now it's up to us to carry on her work, be inspired to do a little bit more, because we now have to make up for a huge presence that is lost, a huge hole in the movement. So please share this episode with others. Everyone should hear Karen's voice and her message for the birds. Be strong, be inspired, and live vegan.